It's a premise that sounds like the stuff of science fiction. For one night a year, all crime is legal. But what if I told you that this dystopian vision has roots in America's past? That it harkens back to a time when the country was consumed by racial violence and social upheaval. Before we start, I would like to remind you that if you're new here, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Did you know that the Red Summer of 1919 got its name from the fact that the violence was so widespread and intense that it seemed as if the country was engulfed in flames? This was a time when African Americans, who had recently migrated from the South to the North and West in search of better opportunities, were met with hostility and violence from white supremacists who resented their presence. In this video, we're going to dive deep into the causes and consequences of the Red Summer of 1919 and explore the connections between this dark chapter of American history and the more recent phenomenon of the Purge movies and TV series. We'll look at how the Red Summer set the stage for the civil rights movement and influenced the way we think about justice and violence in our society today. The summer and fall of 1919 are referred to as the Red Summer because numerous cities in both the North and the South experienced racial unrest at this time. The three most violent incidents took place in Elaine, Arkansas, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. A black teenager erroneously swam into white territory off the 29th Street beach in Chicago on the afternoon of July 27, 1919, sparking a stone-throwing brawl between blacks and whites. The Red Summer of 1919 was a dark and devastating period in American history, where anti-black violence swept across the country for 8 long months. Riots and lynchings broke out in cities and towns from the South to the North, the Midwest, and even the nation's capital. The toll was staggering, with countless lives lost, and many more forever changed. Imagine the hope and excitement that Black Americans must have felt after World War I. They had fought and died for their country, and they believed that they had finally earned the rights that they had been promised to them since the end of the Civil War. It was a time of great optimism, with many black soldiers hoping that they would come to a new era of peace, prosperity, and equality. Little did they know that the reality would be much different and that the struggle for justice and civil rights was far from over. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 had a major impact on Black Americans' lives, even after the disease had run its course. As the pandemic spread, many African Americans migrated to northern cities in search of better opportunities. But when the flu finally died down in the summer of 1919, white people started blaming black migrants for the sickness's spread. It's a sad reminder that even in times of crisis, racism and xenophobia can rear their ugly heads and have long-lasting consequences. But it all started with the tragic drowning of a young black man, Eugene Williams, and things quickly spiraled out of control. Racial tensions boiled over when a white police officer arrested a black man instead of the white suspects responsible for Williams' death, and mobs from both sides began to clash in the streets. The violence only escalated from there, with more and more people getting hurt every day. When it was all over, 23 black people and 15 white people had lost their lives. 537 were injured, and over 1,000 black families had been left homeless. It was a truly harrowing time in our history. However, the events of the Red Summer also served as a catalyst for change. The violence and injustices of the summer of 1919 galvanized black communities and civil rights activists, leading to increased advocacy and activism for equal rights and justice. The civil rights movement gained momentum in the years that followed, with activists and leaders working tirelessly to achieve greater social, political, and economic equality for Black Americans. Certainly, even the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., was not immune to the racial violence that swept the country during the Red Summer of 1919. The trouble started when some white military personnel who had recently returned from fighting in World War I spread rumors about black men allegedly attacking white women. These rumors were further sensationalized by the media in Washington, D.C., stoking racial tensions and making the situation even worse. Before long, the city was consumed by chaos, with an estimated 40 people losing their lives. It's a stark reminder of how dangerous prejudice and misinformation can be, especially when those in positions of power and influence buy into them. Even today, we can see how misinformation and fake news can spread like wildfire, leading to dangerous and destructive consequences. It's up to all of us to be vigilant against prejudice and hate and to stand up for truth and justice, even when it's difficult or unpopular. But amidst the chaos and despair, black people refused to be broken. They fought back against their oppressors with a tenacity and determination that had never been seen before. From organizing protests and boycotts to defending their communities against racist attacks, black people stood up to those who sought to tear them down. The legacy of the Red Summer can still be felt today as racial tensions and injustices continue to plague American society. But the bravery and determination of those who fought for justice during that difficult time serve as a powerful reminder of the importance of standing up for what is right, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. The lessons of the Red Summer continue to inspire and guide those who seek to build a more just and equitable society for all. It's a powerful statement to the strength and resilience of the human spirit in even the darkest of times. The Red Summer serves as a reminder of the devastating impact that racism and bigotry can have on our society, but also of the power of collective action and the indomitable human spirit. We must never forget the lessons of the Red Summer and continue to work towards a more just and equitable society for all. Have you noticed how history seems to repeat itself? Take the plot of the Purge movies, for example. It's all about how violence against black people leads to massive protests and calls for an end to institutional racism. And doesn't that sound familiar? Because that's exactly what happened in real life this past year, with the protests against police brutality and systemic racism coinciding with a global pandemic. It's no wonder that historians and experts in African American history are drawing parallels between the two. It's like we're living through our own real-life version of the Purge. We've watched the Purge movies and wondered if something like that could ever happen in real life. Well, unfortunately, history has shown us that there have been times when it wasn't too far off. The Red Summer of 1919 was one of those times when racial violence swept the country like a wildfire. It was a time of fear and hatred, where black communities were under attack and white mobs roamed the streets with impunity. But what's truly chilling is how similar it all sounds to the premise of the Purge. Attacks on black people sparked protests and calls for an end to institutional racism, just like in the movies. And the fact that it all coincided with a pandemic, just like in the latest installments of the franchise, is eerie to say the least. The parallels between the Purge and the Red Summer of 1919 are striking. In both cases, attacks on black people led to massive protests and calls for an end to institutional racism. And just like in the movies, the Red Summer coincided with a pandemic, adding to the sense of fear and chaos. The fact that these events happened in real life is truly eerie and a sobering reminder of the devastating impact that racism and bigotry can have on our society. The violence and unrest of the Red Summer led to increased racial tensions across the country, with many black Americans feeling disillusioned by their treatment at the hands of their fellow citizens. This sense of disillusionment was particularly acute among black veterans who had served their country in World War I, only to come home and face discrimination and violence. Of course, it's important to note that the Purge movies are works of fiction, and the events of the Red Summer were all too real. But the similarities between the two are a powerful reminder of the dangers of unchecked hatred and division, and the need for all of us to work towards a more just and equitable society. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more upcoming videos.